Okay, so I think we have a super full program, so I'm going to go ahead and kick it off. And for folks just joining, do introduce yourself in the chat. Hopefully, we'll have time for breakouts and more conversation with between us. But we're going to start out with some kind of quick presentations from the panelists that include all the folks you just heard from. And then we'll hopefully have about 30 minutes for breakouts to focus on topics that everyone is interested. So as you're listening, keep in mind, we're going to be asking you at the end of the hour to sort of say which topics you would most be interested in diving into if you're able to stay for the smaller group discussion. So just giving you some warning that we're gonna have participant initiated breakout topics. So I am going to start off with a bit of an orientation and overview of some of the landscape around sort of revenue and fundraising. And then we have a fantastic group of experts and advisors that represent different sectors like philanthropy and health and ed tech. And we have two teams from our Connected Wellbeing Impact Studio, the Experience Craft, which Matthew is going to be representing, and Maven Youth, which Monica and Sam will be representing, to talk about their own experiences in their programs and orgs and how it interfaces with these different approaches, and kind of really grateful for the teams to be open to having a kind of open fishbowl model where we can do sort of real-time conversation about some of the challenges that folks are grappling with, because in this space, there are general models and approaches, but all of the organizations and programs are quite unique because it's this emergent intersectional space. So working with some worked examples of actual founders and programs, we thought would be a valuable way to kind of round out the conversation. But let me start and see if I can get this. Okay, how's that look? Good? Okay, so I wanted to start off by just kind of grounding a little bit of the broader ecosystem for how nonprofits tend to evolve and grow. And all of the teams in our Impact Studio are actually nonprofits, but with a really diverse range of revenue and fundraising models. And often the kind of funding that one would seek is tied to what stage the organization, the program is at. And there's lots of different versions of this kind of nonprofit life cycle, but I think just a simple kind of recognition that there's some early stages, which is like the ideation stage. There's kind of the seed funding, when you're trying to build the thing and get it off the ground. There's the phase when you're seeing growth and traction, and then there's the sustaining stage. And then finally, with nonprofits, especially in the tech sector, there's a constant process of review and renewal that has to happen that often brings organizations back to some of the problems of fundraising and strategy in the earlier stages, which I think we'll see that with some of the teams that will be talking today. So just a really high level overview, and this is, more just the map that our advisors will be diving into some of these models more deeply, but trying to map based on the stage that the program or organization is at and the types of revenue and fundraising that often are leverage within the kinds of impact oriented and youth and tech focused programs that we're looking at in the connected wellbeing space. So government funding is obviously a big one, and the early stage, there's often kind of innovation type funding that comes out of more innovation focused sources like the Institute of Educational Sciences or the National Science Foundation. As organizations grow and are looking for more sustaining funding, then the problem starts to transition to the kind of how do you translate and spin out some of the innovation into more in-system type of funding. And depending on the program, it might be school or district or health related fundraising, but that's often the holy grail of sustaining fundraising. If possible, not all organizations have these opportunities to build ways that you have a consistent funding stream through public sources, because then you have the ability to align mission with your growth and sustaining revenue. But with the innovative spaces that we're talking about, often those types of funding are very difficult to unlock compared to more traditional kinds of like education or health delivery models. So a lot of what we end up, I think this middle zone of private donations and grants is where a lot of organizations end up sitting. And then, Karina will be help us untangle some of this with her background in philanthropy, but then kind of understanding the really complex diversified field between like these big foundations that do strategic philanthropy versus like the corporate sponsorship, family foundations, individual giving, and even within the larger foundations, they often have different pockets that are oriented towards these early stages versus sustaining phases. And a lot of that can be kind of challenging for folks to sort of suss out from the outside. So, I think Karina represents a lot of the expertise in this area, but I've experienced it from the other side of the table where I've been trying to raise funding from a lot of these different sources and really understanding how the both the content of the programs, but also the stage of the organization structures what kinds of funding you can unlock in these areas. And then the last one, which we have David Ball and Jen Wu representing a lot of knowledge from the for-profit sector, but also the kind of intersection with nonprofits that can potentially grow and sustain with earned income, whether it's revenue from customers, B2B contracts with schools, health type organizations, consulting, that this is another really critical dimension that nonprofits are often under leveraged in, which is the earned income side of the equation for sustaining and growth. So that's just a quick overview. That we don't have anybody doing a deep dive on the federal funding. It's something I'm happy to speak to if folks want to talk about that in the breakouts, but I didn't think that it was as critical focus, at least for the teams that are here today. It's a longer ramp to get these kinds of grants. Usually you need a university research partner. The proposal development is highly technical. It's a competitive process. You also have to be kind of in the network with these different agencies and program officers. If somebody is interested in a deep dive on that, again, happy to share more within breakouts or offline as well. So I think this is a bit of a foreshadowing of Karina's, what Karina will speak to, but I think the famous quote is, if there's so different foundations. So if you've met one foundation, you've met one foundation, and very little generalizes between foundations and their approach. But there are some kind of common principles or ways of like parsing the differences. A lot of the bigger foundations, when you see words like strategic philanthropy or catalytic fundraising, that's the kind of don't call me, I'll call you kind of version of the foundation, where they're really operating from their own strategic objectives and seeking out people who fill their investment thesis, versus a lot of the foundations that are on the public side, which are open field-driven foundations. So even within our sector, there's a few like that, like Spencer, William T. Grant, for example, that does open solicitation calls. And those are generally well known because people, apply to them every year and they have a more public visibility. But the majority of fundraising doesn't happen through these open calls with private philanthropy. And often you have to build common cause and relationships. It's not a super transactional thing like you have within these competitive calls. You have to be in the public eye, you have to be in the network. You have to try to get press. You have to translate your work in ways that are visible and understandable to people who are working in these impact areas. Um, so I just pulled an example from the MacArthur Foundation of the like, don't call us, we'll call you approach. Most of these foundations, they don't really want unsolicited proposals. So you have to find both the alignment and the way into get into the network and on their radar. So aside from like the strategic foundations or catalytic foundations that are driven by kind of a theory of what they're trying to influence in an approach, a lot of, most of the giving in the country is actually individual giving, right? So the foundation giving is big, but the distributed sort of charitable giving landscape is actually bigger than what we think about as like the Ford and Rockefellers and Gates and all those foundations. And then, as you'll notice, corporate is actually pretty small within that ecosystem, but I think in tech, we have a little bit more of a skew towards corporate. And then religion is the biggest, but education is really high up there. Health is pretty high up there as well. So our work does have a pretty high profile for private giving as well. And then corporate sponsorship, which again, we won't have anybody speaking specifically to corporate, although I think, Maven has a really strong history there, so can maybe speak to this more than I do. I don't have as much background, but, there's for work in tech and youth, obviously it's an opportunity area, but there's some sort of unique aspects of corporate. It's like there has to be, alignment with the brand strategy. You have to be able to speak the language of what they understand as adding to their kind of value in terms of their brand. There needs to be very communicable, snackable, shareable outputs, and then you have to realize that corporate strategy and attention spans are often quite short, so be flexible. So I think that might be all for my structured presentation. And let me stop the share. And I'm happy to answer any questions via chat if folks have things that came up, but I'm going to turn it over to Karina to talk more about philanthropy.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mimi. Hi, everyone. I'm going to start with a story. I don't have any slides. So I was recently asked to introduce myself at a meeting with the prompt, "Why do you do what you do?" And this is the story I told. I said when I was little, I wanted to be a fashion designer, a diplomat, and a teacher in exactly that order. And I had no social capital in those places. My dad was a dentist, and my mom was busy trying to figure out how to build a real estate. And neither of them put me in a box. And I hated it when people put me in a box along the way. And I met people who encouraged me, who mentored me, and appreciated my expansiveness and my creativity. And they helped me get jobs and develop skills related to all those jobs. And today I have none of those titles and all of those skills. And I do what I do because I want folks to see all the possibilities for themselves in their work. I'm a strategist by nature and a designer by heart. I've worked in philanthropy for over 15 years. And when I left, a headhunter said to me, like, I was trying to figure out what was I going to do with my life. And she had never found me a job. And she said to me, "You don't want a job. You want a place where you can use all your skills, and you have to create that for yourself." So I run my own design strategy and leadership advisory, and that's what I do. I want to talk a little bit about philanthropy and why I think there's an opportunity for you and what I think the challenges are and opportunities are for you. So um, after about over 15 years in philanthropy, I wasn't seeing an impact. And at the Gates Foundation, I was one of those large family foundations. I invested hundreds of millions of dollars. I am both proud and ashamed to say. Um, and I think that I didn't see an impact because the way strategies are put together, which is why I always focus some of my work on strategy. And there's an obsession with foundations, as you all know, because you've all tried to probably get money with sustainability and scale versus relationships or innovation, with the solution versus the problem, and the narrow ways in which impact can be defined versus cross-discipline or even leading indicators versus lagging indicators. And I really saw that nonprofits needed funding models that were very different and diversified. So and we needed to rethink strategy. So I'm trained as an educator and a policymaker, and I went back to school to be a designer and an innovator. And here's a little bit of kind of the advice that I have for you as you think about business models. One is there's something called a business model canvas. And if you haven't seen it, you should just Google it, business model canvas, and a graphic will pop up. And that graphic is a very centralizing center of gravity that every nonprofit should have. And if you don't, and you can't fill in those boxes, that's part of the problem. So that's like first thing I'd recommend. And then there are two organizations I want to mention that have business models that I think are strong, but I want to be clear that they don't speak to equity and youth the way you do. That's what you do. So when I mention these orgs, I mean, you should look at what they do for their business model and do what they do better, is what I would say. So one of them is called Project Lead the Way. You can Google that. The CEO is a guy named Vince Bertram. And I met him along the way, and I was really impressed. They sell a set of services. They use philanthropy as a small slice to do R&D versus their core operating. And he figured out how to sell services and products and tools in a way that he doesn't have to rely on philanthropy, but he can use philanthropy for innovation. And so I was always really impressed with that model. The other model is by a woman named Mona Morshed, and she runs an organization called Generation. And Generation is like a workforce development, economic development company. Both of these organizations I would consider at quote unquote scale in a certain way. They support Generation supports entry level workers and they help them get jobs, but they don't just do job training programs. They only work in a city in a field because there are a set of employers that actually want to hire people for those jobs. And she leverages public private dollars to do it. And I've always thought that that model Generation was one of the most powerful business models actually in the nonprofit space and scaled it very, very quickly. She started actually outside of the United States because she knew she couldn't get money and she wanted to innovate in actually much outlier type situations and then brought the model to the United States. So that's the other one. That I think has a very interesting business model. The other piece of advice I'd say is about funding is about relationships. So I want to give you the names of 3 or 4 organizations that I think are really good at building relationships. So one is Equal Opportunity Schools, and it's run by a guy named Sasha Robkin. There's I think Sasha might be the president. There's someone else who's the CEO. But what's beautiful about what Sasha does at Equal Opportunity Schools, and they are in your space, they are a very youth agency. They won a McKinsey Scott grant recently, so they're a bit of an outlier in that. But before that, they were actually at a certain level of scale. He's a super curious person. And when I was at the Gates Foundation, his portfolio was not in my portfolio, but he met me at a meeting and he thought I had some interesting ideas and I thought he had some interesting ideas. So we got on the phone and we have been thought partners ever since. He wasn't coming to me for money. He was coming to me for thought partnership and curiosity and those kinds of things. So I think relationship matters. And he really modeled that to me as an organization that I think is at scale that's trying to do really important things for young people. The other person that I think about, there's an organization in California, based out of California, called Justice Funders. Some of you may know of them. It's an incredible network. I'd encourage you to seek out their services and the folks there. But there is a person there, his name is Mario Lugay. And he used to be running some sessions on how do you move away from a transactional model and relationship with funders that I thought were so powerful. So I don't know if he has anything online or he's still doing that, but he is a former organizer and then went into philanthropy. And so I think he might be a kindred spirit to a lot of where you are headed and how you think about building relationships. And then the last organization where I think they have a very interesting kind of business model and relationship model, but I've actually never talked to anyone there. I've only seen it online, and some of you may know it. It's called the Creative Reaction Lab. It's in St. Louis. And what's interesting about their work is that they're focused on um, community and social change, is how I would say it. But they have toolkits and they put these incredible, beautiful toolkits and they ask people to to buy the services or buy the toolkit for not very much money that supports their work in a very grassroots community-oriented way. And they just have the inclusive and beautiful way in which they are trying to move their work is in I think of it as relationship building and also innovative funding models. But I actually have no idea how much money is in the bank, whether they're scaled or any of those things. I just think what I see online might speak to some of you. Okay, and then the last organization is actually an organization that full disclosure, I'm an advisor for them. It's called Raise for Good. And they believe in fundraising, but they take a storytelling approach. And so they often have webinars that are free to any organization. And they try to get money from philanthropy to pay for other organizations within networks. Like, for example, they have, I think it's either the Pinterest Foundation or I can't remember who it is, gave them a grant to support all of their grantees. So they often work in that way, that if there's a common funder, corporate funder, they try to get money from the corporate funder to support all of their grantees. But they have a lot of free events and things like that that I think are worth looking at. It's called Raise for Good. It's run by a woman named Maria Choi. And I think they do a really good job at storytelling. Okay, so I want to end with what do you need to be successful, is what Mimi asked me to talk about. You know, just like anything in life, you need a balanced portfolio. So you need multiple revenue resources, and it can't be all eggs in one basket, as my mom used to say. So I think that the ones that I talked about at the top of the discussion, they have a larger proportion that is revenue versus philanthropy. And at some point you want to get there, but nobody starts there. Very few nonprofits start there. So you have to take baby steps towards it. I can talk about any of the tactical things that Mimi wanted in the breakouts, you know, like how do you get money? How do you approach a funder? Who would I go to for this? Or any of those things. So I'm happy to do that. And I won't do it here. I'll leave you with it. Don't be disheartened when you get like the rejection. You just have to keep going after the dollars because you have to change the way. And I'm going to say we as if I still work in philanthropy because I still sometimes have that hat on, even though I don't do it anymore. I did it so many years that it's part of my identity now. You have to change the way we do things. And I want to take ownership for what philanthropy does, to be honest. That means you have to say no. So when a philanthropy wants you to do something and it's like out of mission, out of something, you have to say no. And you have to have the courage. It seems like I'm this little nonprofit. I actually need $10,000. How do I say no? You have to say no, and you have to be clear about what no means and why, and what would be really useful. Remember, you're trying to build a relationship. So this is not a no, forget you. This is here's what would be helpful. Here's how I think about it. Here's what I really need. And then you are making a request, not a demand, if you will. So if you know Marshall Rosenberg's nonviolent communication, he has a great model for that, if you will. So I do think you have to say no. And I think it also requires you to figure out, even though you're saying no, how to frame your work to get in the door. And this is the paradox that I've just told you to walk away from someone. But I also think you have to be able to tell the story in a way. You all work at the intersection, a very important intersection. And at that intersection, it's very hard for funders in education versus health versus technology to get what you do. And you might have to talk to each one of those funders. I just recommended someone who was interested in education yesterday. I said, you should actually be talking to Patagonia. And she was like, what? I said, because at the heart of what you want to do is actually about nature and beauty. It's not, it happens to have work in education where you want to do it, but Patagonia is what you're actually after. So you have to really be creative. And I think you have to be able to frame what you want in the way. And that means you have to do the research about what funders, what the strategic or catalytic funders want and where they are, and reframe. So that's the concept I want to leave you with, is this notion of reframing. You have to reframe what you do in a way that they can hear you and see you. And you have to push funders to reframe their own mental models about what impact and scale is. And you can only do that by telling your story and doing your own reframing first. And so that notion of reframing, what does it mean to reframe your work for a catalytic or strategic funder or private or corporate funder that doesn't get what you do, so that you can begin a relationship and sit at the table because you deserve to be at the table? Okay, that's all I have to say. And I'm happy to talk tactics and wisdom and all those kinds of things in a breakout if anyone's interested later. Thank you.
Thanks, Karina. I'm going to just keep things moving. So I'll give it over to David.
Thanks so much. I mean, just kind of continue on that conversation around reframing. I think a lot of the way that I think about my career has been in this context of being a round peg that's trying to push something into a square hole, right? And the intent is not to just frustratingly bang that round peg into that square hole, but it's to start to think about how to reshape that square hole so it fits that round peg a little bit. And I think if we think about these different contexts, whether it's a funder, whether it's a public service, whether it's a government, whether it's a potential customer, like a lot of the jobs that you all are doing is thinking through how to reframe and shape what you're trying to provide and the impact that you're trying to have, whether that's a social impact or an environmental impact, into these existing enterprises and structures that may not be designed and may not be structured to have the type of impact or the types of services or reach the types of audiences that you're doing that work. I'm also going to start with a story because Karina inspired us to do so, and I think that it makes it feel a little bit more real. But about a decade ago, I moved to the Dominican Republic to be a contractor for Major League Baseball, and each Major League Baseball team in the Dominican Republic has an academy, and they have about 50 to 100 teenage kids from across Latin America who come to that academy. They drop out of school, they're full-time focused on baseball. I love baseball, but I do not love the impact that the system was having on these young people. 99.9% of these young people had aspirations to make it to the major leagues, but would never get to that point and would be left, without an education, coming back to the Dominican Republic with not a ton of life skills, right? And so I first went to work for them thinking that, oh, I'm going to create this vocational training program for Major League Baseball so that all the kids that are wrapping up their baseball careers come back and can get a vocation and can go into the workplace and have a good livelihood. Immediately learned within the first 2 weeks of working there that would be admitting that Major League Baseball was at fault for the work in the system that they were creating by leaving these folks without vocations. And so completely pivoted within those next couple of months that I was working there to focus on how could we integrate education and life skills and social and emotional learning into the academies themselves with the value prop that would ultimately help these baseball players go further in their careers so that the owners of these teams and the folks who are holding the budgets could invest, $100,000, $200,000 into these academies to support the education. Ultimately, we were able to get a number of teams to sign on and buy in and increase their investment in education. But it's this mindset around thinking through how to find that value prop for the different kind of customer or enterprise or donor or philanthropy that I really want to encourage you all to think through as you start thinking through different types of revenue models. So give me a second here and I'm going to share my screen. I no longer work for Major League Baseball. I currently work for Headstream, which is an innovation program that's focused on supporting many entrepreneurs like yourselves. I see some familiar faces here as well from folks that have participated in our accelerator program. We have about 20% of our participants who have historically been nonprofits. And many of those nonprofits come to us because part of our requirement is that they're searching for sustainable business models, right? And to not be consistently dependent on grants or donations to sustain the work that they're doing. A question that we often start with is, is this revenue model going to be your primary revenue stream, or is it going to be a second revenue stream? And if they say the primary revenue stream, I think we get really real and honest, right? And we talk about the complexity. I think this is a picture of the complexity of the healthcare system in the United States. And what I'm going to talk through is largely a perspective on domestic US types of models that we've seen work and examples of those. I'd be happy in a separate conversation to talk about international models as well. I think those, especially in the healthcare system, are a little bit different. But if you are selling a service or a product as your primary funding model, I think we start to explore these types of areas to make sure that you're ready to jump into the commitment and the level of effort and the resourcing that it takes to navigate these markets, right? Do you have the distribution channels? Are you going to be able to invest and have the resources to market so that you can get customer acquisition? Are you familiar with the complexity of the healthcare system as an example, and can you navigate that bureaucracy, and do you have the patience to navigate that bureaucracy, right? I think for a lot of the products that we work with, which are all tech products, can you build a competitive tech product, right? Do you have the budget to hire engineers, or do you have the student workforce or a volunteer workforce to be able to do that? I think an area where we actually see nonprofits leading the way in our cohorts is with demonstrating the efficacy and impact of your product or service, right? If we think about selling into a healthcare system, for example, they're going to want to see that efficacy before they invest or pilot that product. More realistically, though, is that the majority of the folks that we work with are thinking about selling a service or a product as a secondary funding model. And I imagine that for many of you who are considering this or already doing this, you might see yourself in one of these different models. So quickly, to just go through these five models that we've seen before. The first is the beneficiary model. So imagine bringing in a customer through one of your programs. It could be a camp, right? And that person comes on as their first touch point as a participant or a customer, and they continue as alumni or as a future donor of that work. On the flip side of that, imagine bringing in and working with a corporation through their CSR department. That is a really good entry point where they are giving you a donation to do some of the work that they're doing on a small scale, and that's your entryway to start piloting your product or your service for the company itself, and not just through the CSR department. Differentiated pricing is probably something that you're all familiar with, right? Offering a similar product or service and just charging differently for the different types of customers. I'll give an example of that from one of our cohort members on the next slide. B to C to B is a mouthful, but a number of you are probably already demonstrating success and utility and a value prop with small groups of customers or users. They don't always have to be customers. And that demonstration of success or that kind of groundswell can lead to selling to an entity. So imagine selling to a group of teachers, right? And that group of teachers then can go to the school, or that's a group of the teachers can then go to the district, and you can start to sell to that entity. Mimi talked a little bit about government contracts. I won't go a ton into that. There are a lot of local and state governments that utilize nonprofits, especially for health service delivery in and out of school. And that's certainly expanding as the work that we do is very focused on mental health. And that's certainly expanding as more health services around student well-being get expanded into schools. And then having a consulting arm, your expertise can really be leveraged and to be shared for different services and different kind of areas where folks are seeking that out. And so looking at expanding beyond what you're just focused on as far as a programmatic deliverable, to also not devalue the expertise that you have on a specific topic. That could be youth, that could be equity, it could be a different area that you all are working on. So a couple of quick examples from innovations that we've supported. And to be upfront, not all of these are nonprofits. A number of them are. We've worked with across from B Corps to social enterprises to nonprofits, but the types of models they're using feel applicable to nonprofits. The beneficiary model, Throughline, which is a platform that provides referrals and identification of at-risk young people when they need mental health or suicide prevention support. They went from receiving CSR funding from a number of big social media companies to becoming a service provider for those big social media companies. And so they built that trust, they built those connections through the CSR departments, and then that was their entry point to taking on these social media companies as their biggest customers. Differentiated pricing. We have an example here from Weird Enough Productions. They are a comic book that depicts people of color as the protagonists of their comics and focuses on the well-being through their storytelling. They explored different price points, both with different schools, but also with brands, right? They were able to kind of create custom comics for brands and sell those at high price points, so that they were able to provide their products, the comics, as education tools to different schools that may not have been able to afford those otherwise. Close Gap is a really good example of B to C to B. They started by working specifically with teachers. And so selling into schools can be really challenging, as Jen's going to get into. But one way that folks do that is by working specifically with teachers, right? And those teachers become the champions of those products. And through that, Close Gap was able to start selling to schools and starting to look at districts as well. And then consulting services as the last one, right, is Snowbright Studio. They are largely a table and video game based company, but they have an incredible expertise in the education sector and how to win government contracts. And so they're able to create a consulting arm that brings in revenue to support some of their other work in the game development that they do. So there's a number of really successful examples out there, but I also just want to be really like upfront and real. This is really challenging, right? And I think that it can look alluring as something to start out on to create a new revenue stream, but it's really worth putting a lot of thought and diligence in before you begin. Here's a couple of key questions that we often ask or that are worth you all thinking through before you jump in. Is there a clear need for this product or service? I think, using my example of Major League Baseball in the Dominican Republic, right? I felt like there was a need, right? But was the value prop aligned with the customer that they couldn't currently fulfill that, or did they want to fulfill that need? Is your organization or the ones that other supporters and funders are aligned with the prioritization of the resources to invest in this new initiative? It generally takes a lot of time, resources, and effort to be able to prioritize a new revenue stream. So making sure that there's alignment internally and with the supporters and funders so that time and effort is being spent, is being championed by the folks who are integral to the success of your organizations. Does your team have the talent and capacity? We talked a little bit about that engineering piece. We often see that, right, where there's a desire to build a tech product, but not necessarily the expertise to be able to build that within the nonprofit. And then what time horizon are you willing to allocate to this? This could take a year or 2, 3 years, right? Do you all have the patience? Do your funders and supporters have the patience to do that? And then will selling a product or service impact your organization's culture? Sometimes it's not a good fit, and it's worth considering whether your team, whether your organization's mission is aligned with starting to sell and seek out customers, if that feels a little bit different than what you all have historically done. So I'm happy in breakout rooms to really jump into to start helping you all answer some of these questions, to explore some of the different models, and would love to hear some of the ideas that you all are either working on already or that you've considered, or maybe even just how you want to start. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, David. I'm gonna let Jen take it away now.
Hi there. So nice to see all of you. My name's Jen Wu, and I work with Reach Capital. And the work that we do is we are actually venture capital funders, and we fund entrepreneurs who are building for-profit companies. And before everyone cringes and turns me off, I'll give you a bit about my background story and how I came to doing this work. This is nothing I'd ever expected, but I have kind of this mixed background going back and forth between the for-profit and the nonprofit sector. So I have kind of all the check boxes you'd expect of someone in the for-profit sector. I have an economics degree, I have an MBA, I worked in tech startups that are venture-backed here in Silicon Valley and went through 3 of those before I got driven away is a little harsh, but let's say disillusioned with the climate I was working in, and really was searching to doing more meaningful work. And I really wanted to impact people's lives. So in a fit of idealism, I left that career and became a 4th grade teacher in San Jose. I went straight into the classroom, had no idea what I was doing the hardest job I've ever done in my life. Is one of those jobs that I felt like I could work as hard as I possibly could and I could still fail. Frightening. But I stuck with it for a good 4 years, and I stayed in education ever since. Really developed much more of an equity mindset, going into this. And my fit of idealism, I thought, if I could change one kid's life, that will be worth it. And then I realized, no, we can't just affect one kid's life. Every kid in my classroom has to succeed. And then realizing that within the system we were in, that I was working in a public school in San Jose, that the system just wasn't well set up to support teachers to do that well. Not just at the school level, at a district level, there are just so many challenges that were beyond teachers' control. So I actually stayed within the system and tried to help to improve kind of systems and structures within the public school system. Like, how can we make our public school system more robust to be able to better support the hard work being done in the classrooms? So I worked with education nonprofits, really focused on educational equity. And then at some point, it was just really hard work, hard to make an impact, hard to make a sustainable impact. You lose a few key leaders here or there, you lose a teacher, and all the hard work that we did within a school to try to change the culture and build up the training and professional development, it all fall apart in year 3 or 4. So then I thought, well, can I bring in my technology experience from before and be able to use technology to help make that hard work easier, right? So can we make it more sustainable? Can we make it more scalable? Can we make it easier for teachers to do their jobs? So that brought me into ed tech, certainly with a equity focused, and can we use technology that way? And so bringing my worlds together, I did work with some ed tech companies in the nonprofit sector, but really looking at for-profit models to really be able to make scalable, sustainable models in the for-profit sector, taking advantage of a number of the resources and mindsets and ways of working. So at Reach Capital, we're impact investors, weighing financial return just as much as social impact. I bring to the team and our investment strategy really kind of the operational experience of what it's like to work in schools. Will these solutions work on the ground? Will they be used? Will they have their intended impact? And really think about that from a product perspective, from the types of products that we invest in and how do we support companies to do that work. So what I'm sharing today is I've seen so many different ed tech companies, and ed tech is for Reach is not just K-12. So that's my particular focus area. That's what I'm going to talk about today. But we'll see companies all the way from early childhood, K-12, higher ed, or just post-secondary even, really workforce development. And we see lots of models of selling to schools or even selling directly to consumers. But really with the goal of making education more accessible to really unlock opportunity, using education as that lever. So that said, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the different business models that we've seen. So really thinking about, are these earned income opportunities for your products and services? And are there things that we might be able to learn from the for-profit sector that work on that, that might work? Let me share my screen if I can figure out how to do that. And you would think I would know that after all these years of Zoom. I don't see that as a choice. I think it's this. Okay. Excuse the fancy slides. I kind of went overboard on graphics, but anyway, they're just more talking points than anything else. And so I'm going to start 3 basic business models, and you might hear some of this jargon. David, I'm following up on David's work. So I think everything that, just about most of what he said is relevant in the ed tech sector, as well as the health tech sector, healthcare sector. So B2B is the one I'm going to spend most of the time on, and we can talk more deeply on in the breakout rooms. And B2B is shorthand for business to business. And in this context, your organizations are the business. So you're a business selling to other businesses. And in this context, those other businesses are entities like schools and districts, potentially government agencies. Really, I guess the differences between these business models is who is paying for the solution, right? And so if we want schools to pay for these solutions, so students have free access to it, so students and families are not having to pay out of pocket, this is a good model to enable that, right? And so here's some examples. I'm just choosing some illustrative examples, why this kind of makes sense. So I don't know if you know of Canvas. Canvas is an LMS that many schools use. You might use like a Schoology, and that's the way teachers might assign homework. Kids can return homework. They can communicate with parents to see what's going on in the classroom. And you can imagine why you have to buy something like that at a business level, right? The whole school or the whole district needs to be standardized on something like that. So that's kind of why you need to sell to a business, as opposed to selling to like a teacher or a parent, right? It just doesn't work. It kind of makes sense in that context. I chose a couple other wellness examples. So Second Step is actually, anyone familiar with Second Step? It's an SEL curriculum that gets sold to districts, and it's got tremendous penetration. I don't know what the latest numbers are. It's like 50% or something like that. But it has been around for a long time. There's a strong evidence basis that teaching social emotional skills to these kids have great life outcomes. If it's graduation rates, better jobs, better relationships. So it's a good solid curriculum, but it's been around for a very long time. And they sell to schools. They stick in schools, so schools continue to pay them for that curriculum. And Cartwheel is actually a for-profit company that Reach actually has funded, and they're based in Massachusetts. So most of you probably haven't heard about them unless you're from there. And even so, you may not have, because they're very early stage. And I highlight them because they've got an interesting B2B model, which is unusual, because as you can imagine, schools can't always afford to pay for this either for these types of services. So Cartwheel's teletherapy, you can imagine the mental health crisis is quite alarming, especially from the, let's say, superintendent's perspective, where their kids are not showing up to school or showing disruptive behaviors or even having suicidal ideation. Like, their kids are not okay. They need to do something about it. And so counselors, school psychologists are just under very short supply. And it's expensive, right? One-on-one therapy might cost $100 an hour. And districts just don't have the funding to pay for that. Well, now the federal stimulus dollars help to fund some of that, but after that runs out, there's not going to be. So what Cartwheel has done is that it's partnering with schools and insurance providers to cover those services with the insurance providers. And so they need to go by a state strategy to line up, let's say 90% coverage of the insurance providers in that state, line up the Medicaid for those families who don't have private insurance. But they do partner with schools to be able to get access to the kids. So it's still a B2B strategy because most of their sales is to schools and to the insurance providers. The families pretty much get it covered for free. So that's a unique variation on it. And we're going to spend more time on that. We can go even deeper in the breakout rooms if people care more about, like, what does it like to sell to a school. The other two, B2C and B2B2C, which is different than what David talked about, and I will explain the difference there. I don't want to spend as much time in here because I don't think it's as good a fit, but it might be for some of you. So B2C, business is you selling to consumers, and the consumers are your users. The students themselves are the families. So who's paying for this? The students and the families are paying out of pocket for this. And so you might have some equity concerns around this. Some examples kind of in the mental wellness space are Calm and Headspace. You're probably familiar with that. Those are free apps to a point, and then there's a premium subscription you can buy. So there's some impact you can have without families paying out of pocket. Little Otter is like a Cartwheel, except it's a high-end product targeted at families who can afford to pay for premium therapy services. And then B2C, in a way, it's a B2C model. Like, ultimately, the parents and the families are paying, but you access those parents and families through the schools. So it's a little cheaper, let's say, to actually get to the families. And so I don't know, I might be dating myself, but as a child, these scholastic book clubs are really popular. I'd get these book orders home, and I'm like, Mom, can I get these books? And then my family would buy books very inexpensively, off the scholastic list. And then the whole school would be the distribution channel. We put in our envelopes of cash and they'd send back books home and get really excited about that. But for scholastic, that was a phenomenal way to reach families, right? Epic is a modern day version of it. It's a digital library. Schools have free access to it. So instead of having your classroom library with books that are leveled into kids' interests, there's digital libraries that kids can read for free. And then if families want to have access to that same library at home, then they can pay a subscription, and it's a nominal subscription, but it's a way for the first B, the business, to access families through the schools. So I think we spend more of a time, and I won't go into these details, but this will give you a hint of what things we could talk about. So if you wanted to sell to schools, and that's the B2B kind of business model, there are a number of things it takes to succeed. And these look daunting. Like, you need to have salespeople. You really need to understand the context of what you're selling into and what the schools and the district's pain points are, which might be a bit different than what you've been focusing on. It's a matter of knowing if what you're working on is aligning. Know who the buyer, the decision maker is. Even know what type of school your solution best fits. Does it fit in rural areas where there aren't as many resources? Does it fit better in urban areas with large districts? Or maybe you can't handle that scale. So you kind of have to need to figure out what kind of schools you might be that might be best suited. You need to know how they're going to pay for this. So you have to understand kind of the budgeting system, where the funds are coming from. And then you need to make sure that you can be a partner to those schools to make sure it's successful. There are other ways to make the B2C model work with more of an equity focus, and I can talk about some of them. I'm not thrilled with many of them, to be honest, but we can talk about it. But how do you make things even more accessible than they currently are and still be able to reach maybe a certain subset of families with a certain subset of services? So that's yeah, we can talk more during the breakouts if anyone wants to go deeper on any of that.
Great, thanks. Thanks so much, Jen. And now we're going to transition to our two Impact Studio teams to share their wisdom and experience in this area, starting, I think, with Matthew for Experience Craft.
Sure. So hi, everyone. I will certainly not be sharing as extensive of wisdom and experience as those before me during this call. I think part of what Experience Craft and then Maven Youth are here to do is just share some of the things we've tried that fall into the lens of what our lovely panelists and presenters have talked about, but also talk about some of the things that we're struggling with, since if this is meant to be sort of like a learning moment, educational space, I would love to get, I guess, the value of just hearing panelists think about some of the issues that we're facing and apply their expertise to them. Listening especially to Jen's discussion about these three different models, business to consumers, business business, then business to consumer. Experience Craft at its core is a Minecraft and Discord server for grieving youth. We are so curious about how we could potentially scale this while still sticking with our values. And I would imagine this is similarly important for a lot of you who are attending this type of workshop or this type of conversation, where all of your organizations are also extremely values driven. One of our values that creates, not necessarily friction, but definitely adds a few different lenses to how we think about scaling, is that we do not want the end users, grieving children and grieving families, to bear the burden of paying for this service. We really want to keep this as accessible as possible, as widespread as possible. At its core, the goal of this program was to reach as many grieving children as possible around the globe, right? We partnered with another nonprofit, Experience Camps. They do in-person programming. We wanted to make it even more accessible than that, and so we went with virtual. So when we're thinking about keeping this platform accessible, we're thinking about keeping this free forever for the end user, which is, again, like a child who is grieving the loss of a family member, grieving the loss of a friend, grieving the loss of a teacher or a member of their community. We do have to think about, if we're going exclusively towards philanthropic funding, which is where we're currently sitting, or if we want to start thinking about similar to, I can't remember the name. The one that wasn't Little Otter, that was the business consumer, but there was one maybe that was business to business, where schools were supporting with that teletherapy. How we could begin to access these types of organizations, whether they're schools, YMCAs, Boys and Girls Clubs, larger nonprofit organizations who ideally, right, have a vested interest in supporting the hundreds of thousands of youth that have come out of the pandemic or just existing in the world right now, who are grieving, who aren't finding the supports that they need in their immediate community. And so while I can talk forever, I guess, about some of the things that Experience Craft has done in terms of fundraising and our goals of philanthropy. What I'm most excited about is just when we go into these breakout rooms, or potentially even now as a larger group, to hear from some of the panelists strategies or thought processes or practices that have tended to work as you try to scale these like really small niche solutions, right? It's a Minecraft Discord service where we're looking for kids who are kind of into gaming, they're kind of into tech, they're sitting in this particular sphere of play forward therapy, where a huge component of it is building this community in a very online space. So it's a little niche in its own way, and bringing that to a space where video games tend not to be their primary outlet, right? If I go and talk to a principal of a school, their first thought probably would be something like teletherapy. Their first thought probably wouldn't be a community-based play forward space in Minecraft. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm excited to hear from everyone, panelists and attendees, just around thoughts for this type of program. I'm excited to answer questions about it too, but I think I'll stop there and pass things over to Maven Youth. That's just sort of where we're sitting for Experience Craft. And I know I want to get us into the breakout room so we can actually discuss. I'm looking at the time. I don't want to take up any more of our precious time together.
Great. Thanks so much, Matthew, and for starting to put some potential discussion topics, which I'm going to hand the baton over to Team Maven Youth. But as we are getting close to the transition, if folks have other topics that they would like to dig into, feel free to put it in chat, and we can do our best to try to structure the breakouts around that. So Monica and Sam.
Hello, everyone. So I'm Monica once again, and Sam will be joining in. I'll hand out, it's a tag team effort of trying to do the speaking part. So I'll try to keep mine brief. That way Sam can share as well. So Maven Youth, who are we? What is it that we do? So we are a national nonprofit, and our goal is really to move an LGBT youth from being a consumer of technology to being an innovator of technology. And we do that by one of our flagship program is our summer tech camps. We do it on a national level. We travel from city to city, offering a 2-week free camp for LGBT youth and allies to come in and learn and meet people in the industry. We do hackathons, we do workshops, we do speaking engagements, and sometimes we pair with LGBT centers to offer ongoing workshops with them. So going back to kind of the Karina kind of sparked something when she said to me, said to the group of how to say no to funders. And I quickly, in the onset of Maven Youth, because my background was always in the nonprofit sector, working with LGBT youth, when I started Maven Youth, I learned early on what it means to say no. And a lot of it is because just of the years of being dictated by our grants. And even though we applied for the grant, but really the grant is kind of shaped by the funder who says, this is what we want to do, who can do it? So sometimes it was aligned with our nonprofit, and sometimes it was a little bit of a stretch. And so when I started Maven Youth, I kind of knew right off the bat, there's this no to a particular funder, that I wanted to be innovative enough and allow myself to fail. And in foundation dollars, failures not seem to be okay. And so while the tech industry, the tech sector embraces that, failure is a success. And so for me, the early on for Maven Youth, we actually received no grants. A lot of it's actually reversed. For us, our highest level of money coming into our organization is corporate sponsorship. So our corporate relationship that we have with corporate tech companies and banking industries is who we get our dollars. And within that, there's the ERGs, employee resource groups, pride ERGs, individual donations, fee for service, and then there's grants. And a lot of that was really early on shaping because we weren't quite sure. We had a vision for Maven Youth, but we wanted to try on new things to see what was going to resonate with young people. And so we did kind of the flip model of it for us early on. And so now one of our pain points is how to move into the foundation dollars. So we have, like I mentioned, a really strong relationship with the high volume of tech volunteers that come in. So individual donations is really powerful. And then our corporate giving is really great. But it's really how do we then sustain ourselves to merge into other markets and other states. And a lot of that is really kind of focused on the grant. And that's the part where early on when y'all said, you know, there's certain doors you can't really knock on. We want to knock on them, but we have to be invited into the space. And so we've worked so hard in this other angle of giving dollars coming in that we didn't really exercise this other level of relationship building with these other types of grants and foundations. The thing that I want to hand off to Sam to talk about, because this will really guide you if you're interested in coming into our breakout group, is really that corporate giving. And so I want to hand off the many ways and different levels that corporate gives, how we get corporate dollars, just beyond just, you know, Google giving us money. There's many levels to how we get money from Google. So I want to hand that over to Sam to talk about our corporate relationships.
Awesome. Thanks, Monica, for giving us sort of like overview. So essentially, like Monica had already mentioned, we typically kind of target kind of like the ERGs or like the Pride ERGs. And Monica has like shared like these ERGs, they're given a certain type of money, especially during Pride season. And so we kind of try to like hone in on that and use that to our advantage to help not only like have them like give us donations, but also to help with like the hosting fees. Typically what we definitely do prefer whatever corporations are able to like give us like a couple few dollars a couple like $100 in donations and also host us. But what we'll typically focus on for our summer camps is hosting. We have them pay for like the room that we're gonna be in, like any food, any snacks, any of that, and basically having them pay for us to be there and show up. And what they gain from that is a really great opportunity to connect with the community, especially like younger people, and give a chance to kind of like give advice to young LGBT folk who are just starting out or even curious about how the industry is. And also like, again, and that comes in like we have the Pride ERGs give us a donation, or even the corporations themselves give us the money for us to be there. It's kind of like we tend to like specifically target the Pride in around like sort of like June time, because that's, you know, got to take advantage of corporate pride. They always want to seem like they're, you know, the big corporations, that they're being progressive and inclusive. And while there are some companies that are, it's great to take advantage of kind of like the corporalization of pride. So that's kind of like what we do with our partners and that sort of thing. Monica, did I miss anything, or did
Yeah. So the other thing that really works well for us is not only do we get Pride money from, let's say, for instance, Pandora, from the foundation arm of Pandora, we will get sponsorship levels, we will get matching from volunteers. So volunteering their time, there's matching dollars with that. And then the Pride ERG itself, we get money. So those are many levels. The other thing that we get is the fee-for-service model is embedded with our LGBT centers. So that's one thing that we would love to scale more than what we currently do. So LGBT centers will say, hey, we want to write a grant to do more STEM work or more computer science education within our workforce arm of the LGBT center. And then that's where we come in. We'll say, great, we can bring you, right, our youth leaders, our whole camp experience for your center. You do the grant writing, and then we do the fee-for-service for you to implement a program within your center. And so we currently do that with a number of centers throughout the United States, being able to create that model and then replicate it. So they enjoy the success and the impact that we have. And so then we end up coming back yet again to build their infrastructure so that they can build their youth leadership, know our curriculum, and then start implementing it within their center all year round versus just within the summer that we're in there. So those are kind of the big buckets that we get our funding for our organization in.
That's great. It's so interesting, I can't remember who was talking about just the importance of the diversified funding, but then, you have, so I think also just between the two programs and orgs, I think Maven has been around for a while and has a sort of mature and diversified funding stream. Connected Camps and Experience Craft that I'm also part of, Experience Craft is a new product within an organization that's been around for a while. So still trying to find that, product market fit or the distribution channels might be a way to describe it. So I think it's also, as we think about which breakout you might want to jump into, slightly different stages, although I think Maven is a good example of you're in a constant renewal and evaluation. So you're trying to unlock some new stuff around the philanthropic. So I think there's dimensions of the emerging strategy for both organizations. And since nobody's really volunteered a burning topic, I'm just going to take moderator's privilege and suggest we do a breakout group around the two teams, one for each team, and people have heard the kinds of problems and solutions each team is grappling with. So why don't we just, in our last 15 minutes or so, and I think we'll probably just end with the breakouts rather than coming back as a whole group because we don't have a lot of time. So Remy, if you could set up the breakouts, we will just let you all choose to jump into them. So if you go in to join a breakout room,
there should be two choices.
See Maven and Experience Craft. So, and I'll just say before we all disperse, thank y'all. This was really a fascinating discussion. I have so many things I want to talk about, but I'll see you in a breakout.